Hello everybody, my name is Matti Suominen. I'm from Nixu, a security company, which basically means that I know exactly nothing about Drupal, so this should go really well, don't worry about that. As it turns out, somebody asked me to come present here something about security testing Drupal and some such, and it just happens to be they are not in the room, no. So it just happens to be that they might be a little bit sore losers because we have tested a couple of their sites and through various sort of audits and such, we've come to a mutual understanding that we know something about security testing at least more than they know about Drupal development, so all is well. Anyway, let's get started. I'll try to keep the presentation part really short, meaning I have no idea how long it takes. And after that, you have plenty of time for questions. If you have something you want to ask, just please do, but let's try to go in some sort of order because I think we are somewhat limited on time. So, to get started with, I was told that this thing is going to be recorded, put into YouTube, whatever, so I had to make a slide first because you see, the problem is I'm actually skipping work right now. I should be doing something productive, and somebody's going to check that I was talking about something useful. So, we are not going to be talking about that at all. Because I know they are not going to go past like first 20 seconds or so. So, we're actually going to talk about Drupal security as mentioned. And I'll go through some basic ideas of what we actually do as security professionals. There are actual security professionals in Nixu as well, I'm not one of them. So, basically go through the steps of what we normally do when we're testing Drupal sites. And the funny thing is that most things I'm talking about, again, have nothing to do with Drupal. And I'm trying to kind of drill this down that when people ask us to test a Drupal site, when they ask us to test this or that, it's actually mostly all the same to us. We don't really care too much about what you make it with. Should become apparent a little bit later on. But basically, I want to start with something. Somebody told me that you have to have some kind of a value statement or an idea to start a speech with, something to kind of get people to understand what we're talking about. And the idea here is, why are we so rich, famous, beautiful, nice people, humble, modest, whatever have you. And my conclusion after thinking about it a little bit is that you are actually the reason why all of this came to be. It's quite literally the fact that we are quite good at what we do, and even if we are not, we are still like adequate at what we do. But the reason we get paid is that you are not. Let's not put it any kinder than that. So a lot of the time when we're testing stuff, it turns out that there are good sites, there are bad sites, and then there are sites made by people who should not be allowed to touch any sort of electronic machinery. And the funny thing is that despite this being an age-old thing, none of this is really new stuff. And most of it is purely common sense. You explain this to anybody off the street that here is a security problem. Do you understand how something like updates work? Yeah, sure. So would you believe that there is an industry where literally lack of updates is one of the biggest problems, and still you somehow manage to update your own computer thingy at home? But these are people who are getting paid to do it, and it's not happening. If you did this for building industry, you would be sued immediately, you would be in jail, all this stuff would happen. But since it's the IT industry and we are agile, it doesn't matter. So, let's start with first things first. So basically, I'm going to go through some of the things we look for, some of the things we test for, while we are doing audits for your system. So this could be your Drupal project of just not any kind really. The very first thing we go through, and this is usually where most of the audits tend to end, because if you go through what kind of modules are being used, have they been updated, is the Drupal from 5 years back, whatever, that's usually where it goes horribly, horribly wrong. And as it turns out, this is how a lot of systems get compromised. Now, Drupal has the same unfortunate side effect as something like WordPress, something like just about any sort of well-known platform. While it's really nice and good that everything is really like made for you, you don't have to do everything again, everybody can use the same stuff, you can all improve it. The downside is that the people who want to get into your system also know exactly what's wrong there. Usually what happens is that when there is a critical vulnerability released, it takes about no time at all for somebody to start scanning your systems and figuring out what exactly is wrong, where can I find sites which are vulnerable, and then their automatic thingies will actually collect all the information and they will automatically hack your systems, regardless of how well you did it, because you forgot to update it. I was actually talking, let's check, no, not here. I was talking to somebody not too long ago and they told me that they are actually, their company, they are selling Drupal sites in two fashions. They are selling a site which they built and configured and it did everything nicely, and then they provide the hosting and they provide the patching. However, they also have a different model which is a little bit cheaper, which is the exact same thing except they don't do the patching. And the customer, some dude who is selling shovels online, is now doing the patching, but they are still doing the hosting. Amazingly enough, this turns out not to be a brilliant concept, because as it turns out, every single one of those hosted customers who are doing their own updates is basically a source of malware now. But I mean, it's like $10 cheaper or something, so clearly a lot of customers gravitated towards that idea. I don't get it. Okay. How many of you heard about this Panama Papers thing? Okay. So, how many of you read into what actually happened from a technical point of view? So there was a whole lot of stuff going horribly wrong. One of the things was that the Drupal version that they were running was a little bit outdated. I think it was a couple of years, 3 years something. Usually when you see something that is 3 years old, and we are talking about this agile thing, it basically means that it has been updated exactly never. Because it's not like somebody updates very frequently for a week or a month or a year, and then they suddenly suffer some brain damage, and then they forget to update for 2 years. That usually doesn't happen. What usually happens is that you throw the website somewhere on this really agile hosting platform that you just Googled from somewhere, then you forget that you actually had it, and the customer paid already, and then you're just gone. And then the customer is thinking that, yes, we have a website. And unfortunately, within a week, it's dead. So yeah, I mean, it's quite sad really, and these are typically not any sort of state-of-the-art hacks. You would imagine this kind of organization, they have some really impressive security in place. They are in charge of huge assets and what have you. And no, just didn't work very well for them. So, the next thing being hardening, and this is interesting because very often hardening is not all that interesting, or if you have a Linux platform, I can tell you that every single audit you will see, there's somebody going to complain about your Linux hardening, and then you say that yeah, you don't do it. And actually the security guy doesn't care either because it's not really that important in the big picture. However, when we come down to Drupal, and actually many similar systems, there's a whole bunch of stuff that is nicely visible by default. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can very easily make visible by default, which will immediately compromise your system. Because the way it works is that if you happen to have certain scripts visible, well, there just goes your site. If you happen to leave some stuff around which contains credentials or whatever, well, that's again your site. If you happen to leave things like the change logs, I mean, what can you do with a change log? There's a text file saying that somebody updated Drupal to add some new feature. So how is that bad? The problem is that these same people who are doing these hacks, they are scouring the internet looking for sites. If they find a change log or some other similar named files, they go and check which version is this one associated with. Now you know exactly what version of Drupal they're running. You just put that into your little database, and when somebody releases an exploit to Drupal version something and up, then you just go back and see, well, who was running some Drupal version that is vulnerable? And within a couple of minutes, your site is now hacked. So you definitely want to do something about this. Again, this is something that we test very early. When somebody tells us it's a Drupal site, we immediately run these tools. You can run them yourself, they cost exactly nothing. They are extremely trivial to use. They will go through things like, do you have specific modules installed? Do you have specific files laying around? Do you have an admin interface open? is your database schema thingy somewhere open, whatever. It will give you a nice list of things. And if you pay us 10,000 euros, we will do the same, and we will give you the same list, and you will think that these guys surely know something about Drupal security, because they managed to run this one tool which took 15 seconds and found all these really interesting vulnerabilities. And your customer is also going to think that we are geniuses because we somehow figured this out. But the problem is that you can do it on your own in 15 seconds, and there is no point in calling us before you have tried it. Absolutely no point. And there's also a whole bunch of modules which will check this for you, which will do the hardening for you. Somebody actually figured all this out. Why it's not part of default Drupal stuff, I have no idea. If you know somebody who is maintaining Drupal, please ask them why that's the case. I don't understand it. But yeah, that's there. So, when we go back from this, so now we have done a couple of things which are really obvious. We check for modules, we check for hardening stuff, and typically we already have a bunch of findings. So then we start scanning the site with something, and typically these are web scanners. We can talk more about them after this. I'm not going to go too much in depth, but basically they try to simulate all sorts of attacks. Not the most sophisticated tools in the world, but they do their all right. One thing we often get asked, and now we get back to the whole issue of how special Drupal actually is. So people often ask us, well, can you recommend tools? And actually I think somebody mentioned this when I came to have this speech, that can you recommend some tools which are compatible with Drupal? I don't even understand what that means, because literally Drupal outputs HTML, it outputs web stuff. The kind of stuff that you could manually code if you were really clever and had a lot of time. There is not really any sort of Drupal-specific security scanning. The ones that are Drupal-specific I already mentioned. Everything else works just fine, regardless of whether you know it's a Drupal or whether you don't know that. Usually we don't have a clue. Somebody just gives us something, says, here's a site, try it out. Okay, fine, let's try it. Let's throw the scanners there, let's do all these tool things. Tools don't care, they just test for things. And this is something you really should be doing on your own as well. Again, I had a customer who built a e-commerce platform, and they really had no business building an e-commerce platform, but they just decided to do it because e-commerce was the thing back then. And it turns out it was basically full of security holes, like literally everywhere. Like any input parameter you would send anywhere was a security issue. And then they started asking when we did the testing that how can they somehow do this testing on their own, that there has to be some sort of magical training to become a security expert, and they might want to train somebody in their company. So I just told them that, run this tool. It happened to be Acronetics back then. Just buy this tool. The license isn't that expensive. Just buy it, let it run. It's a Windows application. An idiot can use it. You just boot it up. It asks what URL you want to scan. You type that in, and there you go. Today they even have a cloud version of that, so you can just go to the cloud, register up, click scan, and the same thing happens. And turns out that within half a year or so, they scanned the website that they made so much that they actually managed to somehow mysteriously fix everything. So that the next time we tested it, there was literally no single issues anywhere. And all they really did was just run this dumb tool over and over and over, and when they found an input validation, whatever, okay, fine, let's fix this. Okay, there's another input validation thing, let's fix this as well. Turns out that was all that was needed, and these guys spent, I don't know how much time trying to figure out how to fix all of this. Again, it's not complicated, we are not doing anything magical with this. It's really simple. The tools are out there, they are available for everybody. I can list a couple if somebody's interested. Okay. Then down to my absolute favorite topic. How many of you are using third-party modules of some kind in your Drupal project that you have acquired from trustworthy sources such as GitHub, or I just downloaded it off the internet? Good.
Just one question, does it include contribute modules, meaning like somebody else has coded it, like in Drupal.org? That's a third party, right?
Yeah, I mean, the generic problem is that this is the guy who made it, or, well, I mean, you cannot be sure at least. This guy made like 50% of them, so your odds are about 50-50 or so. I think IT and IT security in general and software development is an interesting field. Compare this to, for example, again, let's go back to building. So when you are constructing a building like this one that we are in, so imagine that the guys are building those pylons. I presume they are holding the roof up. And it's very sort of scientific thing that you know that when you put certain kinds of stones and stuff in there, it's going to hold a certain amount of weight because somebody did all the math and somebody designed the materials to be exactly like that. And you have very careful designs that say that when you are using this type of construction material, here's how it's going to do. And it's very important that you order the right kind of material from a trustworthy source and make sure that it's actually doing what it's saying. In the IT world, what would happen is that one day, the guy who is building that pylon comes to work and says that, I found this stuff from the, it was on the street, literally, when I was coming to work. And I think this is most likely wood, maybe, I don't know. And this is a piece of metal, it looks very durable. And it's already bent in such a way that we can very easily put it to our pylon, because we were missing just this piece. And let's do that. And then the guys are just like, yes, let's do that. And they start putting the thing which they found from the street into the pylon and just putting something on top of it and saying that now it's really good and we are using open source modules from third parties and whatever nice terms there are. But literally when you are doing that, it's basically a gamble as to who made the module that you are now using. You are not, typically people even tell me that they don't want to make these modules on their own because they don't trust necessarily themselves that it's going to be as good as these modules made by this guy. And my counter question is always that do you know who made it? How do you know that they are not mentally insane, drunk, or just plain malicious? How do you know any of this? You have no idea who this person is. You just got their module somehow and now it's in your system. It's literally a part of the product that you are shipping to a customer and you don't even know who they are, let alone have any sort of way to go back to them and beat them up if it turns out that their module is actually garbage. It baffles my mind. If you are really interested, go and grep through some modules you find from everywhere and look for some stuff like echoes, for example, or something that where you typically see cross-site scripting issues. There are actually, I believe there are actually websites where they go to GitHub or something and try to search for security issues in modules. And they publish like search parameters so you can find all the ones with excesses in them, or SQL injections or whatever. And typically you get tons of hits because most of the projects have never been updated by anybody. Oh, by the way, this guy also doesn't necessarily do all the updates and things, so he may or may not do that. Just keep that in mind. The other part of this that we look into, so okay, now we check your modules that you downloaded from somewhere. Most likely we check your modules that you made on your own also. Finally, the big question to ask from anybody is, did you change the core somehow? Did you tweak the modules that you got from somewhere? Did you make any of these tweaks? And then you get the story that, well, because there was this, because Drupal works in this way and I needed to get this functionality because of blah, 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 it goes on and on and on. And at the end of this really long explanation, you ask the question again, that did you change the core? Well, I had to make a small tweak. No, you didn't have to. There is absolutely no reason to do that. Now you screwed up everything because the updates are likely not going to work anymore or they're going to break your site. Nobody's going to be able to touch them. And now you are explaining to the customer that, well, we cannot upgrade because my custom hack that I just made would break. It doesn't support Drupal version this or that or anything else. Again, very bad. Don't do that. So, let's take one more, because GitHub is my favorite thing in the world. There is some assumption, I don't know if you make this assumption, I hope not, but there is some weird assumption that if you get something to GitHub, that's some kind of recognition of quality or fame, or there is some sort of magical process fairy that makes sure that your contributions are somehow great now. because they are on GitHub, and GitHub is on the internet, and everything on the internet is great. So clearly there has to have been some sort of process. And I know there's, for example, when we publish something to GitHub, we as a company, there was this discussion ongoing, this agonizing discussion as to how much quality control we need to do before we can release it. Because what if there's a problem, what if there's a bug, what if there's a security problem, and we would look like idiots. The problem is that most people don't care, so they just publish anything really. As an exhibit, by the way, there is I hope I'm allowed to swear here, there is a service called Fuck Off as a Service, made in PHP, which you can also download from GitHub. It's really reputable. It opens, I think, some kind of a socket for you that when you send a request, it will tell you to fuck off. So I would just like to point out that if somebody tells you that they found something from GitHub or whatever otherwise supposedly reputable source, or they got it from, I don't know, Stack Exchange, whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody did any sort of checking to it. It might mean that somebody spent 5 minutes on it and slapped it there, because that's what people do. Okay, so moving on, we have checked for the obvious stuff now. Typically this phase where we are now doesn't take more than a few minutes, hours, something. And now we get to the parts where we're actually doing something that kind of looks like security. Code review is something we definitely do, and it sometimes finds something. The biggest and most obvious problems, of course, have been found by now. But then we start looking into this, and again, people ask me all the time that, like, how do you do Drupal code reviews? Like, what do you review? Like, what are the Drupal specific code reviews you need to do? This is an XSS in PHP. I think there was also one in the previous presentation. If somebody was present here, there was one fairly glaringly obvious one. This is very similar to that one, in that if your code looks like this, there is with high likelihood there is a chance that it's horribly broken somewhere. And this is how PHP applications would look like back in the days. You would find this kind of stuff all over the place. So the problem for anybody who doesn't know is obviously that if username comes from who knows where, then it can contain all sorts of funny characters which end up being part of your web page now. And this is called cross-site scripting. So when we are in the magical world of Drupal where everything is different and there's a whole bunch of security stuff which is automatically protecting you from cross-site scripting, the cross-site scripting unfortunately looks exactly the same because it's again PHP code in your module, which is at all not Drupal specific. You can make the same kind of stupid, idiotic mistakes that you can in any PHP code. So it's, in many cases, the issues look completely the same. It's just that there might be a slightly better solution somewhere, or it might be that there is a Drupal specific way to handle the problem. However, the problem itself usually looks exactly the same. It's not something like, there are some languages and frameworks where the framework code looks completely different from anything else. So if you are using something like Ruby on Rails, trying to review Ruby on Rails code or some of the definitions and comparing them against normal Ruby issues would be a bit difficult. With Drupal, with PHP stuff, usually not the case. Very often the dumbest security mistakes you find are something that would be also obvious in PHP. So you still need all the wonderful commands and thingies that you need to use to escape, encode, do all this trickery. Somebody might be able to explain to me, because this doesn't, somebody seems to have stolen the concept from PHP that all of the security related functions have to have really stupid names that nobody can remember or understand. And it's really hard sometimes to figure out if Drupal strict dangerous protocols is an actual function name or not. And if it is, what does it actually do? Somebody asked me, because I compiled this list, and somebody asked me that basically it's a nice list, but that you should basically add less parody into it. So don't just put like made up names. And there's only one made up name in the list. PHP had the same thing. If you have ever used the MySQL libraries, there's a million variations of escape, because they kept figuring out that the previous escapes didn't actually work. So they would put the real escape, number 2, which actually works. So don't use the other ones, which by the way are not deprecated, but you need to know that. Oh, and also, I mean, with Drupal, which handles very nicely your database things, so you don't have SQL injections because you don't write any SQL, except that you have the exact same SQL stuff there. And of course, anybody writing modules is immediately going to start doing some really dumb SQL stuff. The problem is actually very often that if you have a developer who only knows Drupal, they have never ever developed anything else, and this also goes for any other framework, they might not actually know, stupid as this sounds, but they might not actually know what you have to do in, let's say, PHP. If you're writing raw PHP, they might not be familiar with all these concepts. So when they start writing Drupal code, somebody tells them that there is all this funny stuff about the database is just getting manually, automatically, magically handled somehow, and you don't need to do it. And then you never know that there is the SQL injection seems to be making a comeback in some of these cases because people just don't know what it is, and so they never look for it, so they never do anything about it. Okay, so finally we come to the point where we are doing some actual manual testing. Again, at this point we most likely already know how things are. We already know that the application is or isn't going to be any good. But we often do a manual review, a couple of days of actual testing from an actual security specialist. And again, if you have, somebody always asks me, do you have a Drupal specific list of problems that need to be looked for? No, that doesn't make any sense. There is a bunch of web specific lists and they apply just fine. Because again, when you run your Drupal thing and do all the magic and you have your React stuff and Angular stuff and whatever is cool nowadays, changes weekly, whatever you have, eventually at some point it has to translate to something that the web browser understands, because the web browser hasn't changed that much. There's a few technologies like JavaScript which came along. Other than that, eventually at some point you will have the same stuff that has the same problems in most cases. There are some caveats, some problems are more common, etc. But in general, it's going to be there. So do make sure you understand, if you are not familiar with, for example, what the OWASP Foundation does with their security checklists, it's definitely something you need to know and understand, even like the basic, very bare bones level of what are the typical problems. Because once you know those, you can see them in your own code and start figuring out that, okay, now I'm doing something that sounds a bit fishy because somebody mentioned to me that there is this thing called SQL injection. And now I'm writing SQL, so maybe I should know about this SQL injection thing and figure out what I need to do within the Drupal context to get this to work. And finally, this is basically it. With these instructions, a couple of them are a bit more complicated, most of them are really simple things. You should be able to secure your Drupal site pretty well even before the security auditor is ever there. That's really the beauty of this whole thing, because we are not, in most cases, doing anything really impressive. With Drupal sites especially, they are usually fairly simplistic, they are usually fairly typical web applications. They are usually not about crushing genome data or building some sort of hardware integration thingies. No, they're just basically web services of different kind. And as it turns out, it shouldn't be really much of a problem anymore. And we can discuss more about this. The thing, however, I think is that I'll get to see some of you again, because as it turns out, despite all of this information, it isn't exactly a secret. There is no secret cabal of security people who are withholding all the important information that you need to know. It's not exactly like that. Everybody is trying to tell you that this is the information you need to know, and for whatever reason it turns out that it's quite difficult to get the problem fixed. Whether it's a lack of training or whatever, hard to say. That was basically my presentation today. I think I'm just about on time. We still have the 15 minutes, so if you have questions, comments, anything you want to share of the wealth, you want to apply for a job, whatever, feel free.
How much do you typically charge how much do you typically charge for a security audit?
Now we get to the important questions first. That's good. I like this approach really much. Okay, so it really depends. For example, let's say we are targeting a Drupal site. So to keep in context, because it could be anywhere from a couple of thousand to a million. So really hard to say in general. However, if we think about your generic Drupal site, the kind of sites that have been talked about here today, so some kind of a web shop, some kind of a intranet site, whatever, I would say that typically an audit, if it's a bit more comprehensive, so not just like a static site of some kind, we are somewhere in the range of between 5 and 10 man days of work. In the security industry, the prices typically tend to be somewhere around a little bit over 1,000 euros a day. So you end up with like, I don't know, 7 to 10K, 7 to 12K per audit for a little bit more complicated systems. And okay, sometimes you have something a little bit more simplistic, or you have like multiple things made based on the same thing. But in general, that's what we're dealing with something that nobody has seen before. There's no previous experience of any kind. Anybody else?
I wanted to ask, you mentioned that Git is not a reliable source. You mentioned that Git is not a reliable source. Yes, I do agree, but do you think that the amount of contributors actually define the sanity of the code?
Yeah, I think that would be a fair argument to make, that if you have a module, so basically if you want to think about like what would make something more reliable, so obviously the smaller it is, the more reliable it is, because there's less stuff to look into and there's less ways to make it go horribly bad. If there's a bunch of people contributing to it, then obviously that helps, because people usually point out there's eventually going to be somebody who is sane and they are going to point out that this is horrible. So that helps. If it's a module used by a lot of people, so if it's an authentication system, eventually it's going to end up in a system that is going to be audited by somebody who is qualified. So even if the contributors are all insane, eventually somebody is going to test it somewhere, and that is going to go back to there saying that, by the way guys, this is actually not working. So all of these factors definitely contribute to it, and of course there are modules which are quite rock solid. They have been audited again and again and again by different people. The downside, of course, is that it's really hard to evaluate what kind of contribution, how much contribution are you actually seeing. So if it's a bunch of people contributing code, yes, that helps, but you don't necessarily get to see if that system has been audited multiple times. For example, I happen to know that there are lots of authentication modules for different systems that we regularly see in projects. And we know that they work because we have tested a million times. We don't have to do it again. However, we don't exactly write this anywhere. We don't go back to the GitHub page and say that we have audited this now 7 times and it's great. It doesn't happen. So that's one problem. You don't necessarily know. You can assume that it's popular, it's made by a million people, there's lots of contributions. Most likely it's okay. But that's still a most likely. And the more complicated module is, obviously that affects it. So if we are talking about authentication versus we are talking about a slider that shows pictures of puppies, then obviously it's a different thing, because one of these more likely has issues than the other one. Any other questions? I'm wondering if this is another question about money, cars, boats.
So you mentioned that you could list some of those scanning tools. So could you?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so basically when you are testing this kind of stuff, nowadays if you don't have any sort of existing background, most likely you want to go with something cloud-based if your product happens to be something that is publicly available. That's the obvious caveat. So if we are talking about intranet site, if we are talking about highly secret stuff, then you need something standalone that you can deploy somewhere and run it. Because obviously the scanner has to be able to connect and you don't want to publish your site. So, but in most cases, I think most of you are working with sites which can be at least semi-public, so at least you can do like IP filtering to allow the scanner in. In those cases, there's a whole bunch of tools. There's, of course, Qualys is one of the scanners that a lot of people are using. It does both the kind of server-side scanning or the scanning of the underlying layers, the operating system stuff, etc. But it also does web stuff. There's Detectify, there is, what else? Nessus can do this as well, you can get it in cloud as well. There's really a bunch, and I think if you go to Wikipedia, there's a page which lists you pretty much all of those. There might be minor differences in like one being a little bit better, one being a little bit more expensive, but in general, none of them, as far as I know, are absolutely terrible. It's always better to have one than not have anything at all. So that's an option. Then when you are talking about local stuff, so you have to deploy it somewhere, or you want to put it, and this is, by the way, a brilliant use of these tools, you want to put it into your test automation system. So every time you deploy something, or every week, or every whenever, the tool runs and you get an updated profile saying that 3 new issues have been found, and you maybe should fix this. So this is what you want to use these tools for. You can kind of do it with the cloud stuff, but it's a bit harder sometimes. So when you're talking about this kind of deployment model, Akunetic's one of the very often used, a bit more expensive than many, but not too much. Nessus, of course, works quite well. And you can even use some of the security testing tools. For example, we often set up, if some of you might be familiar with a tool called Burp, it's a security testing tool that you typically use as an attack proxy. So you basically set up a web proxy, you proxy all the traffic through it, and then you can modify it on the fly. However, the tool can also do actual automatic testing. So what we do for many customers is we set up a Burp somewhere running, and then you just give it a list of URLs to scan. It goes there, it tries to look through everything, and you get a report which you can easily pull into Jira or something. It's actually very convenient, and the licenses are like $100 a year or something. So there's a lot of options. I can definitely send a more comprehensive list if somebody's interested, but just let me know. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question about, I've been wondering if, from your experience, have you noticed any kind of, well, what is usually, or is there any kind of usual, more kind of common vector attack for the vector, well, whatever it is. Is it more like infrastructure related, for example, web servers and caches and everything, or is it more often the application related stuff, or both? Or
yeah, it's of course you have both, but I mean the application is clearly the leader in this. The thing is that if you, let's say you deploy an Apache, you deploy an Nginx as a proxy, you deploy a database, you do this and that, you throw in some Red Hat Linux. That's fine. By default, if you have some sort of semi-recent version of everything, it's already pretty okay. It's unlikely that anybody is going to hack it very easily, at least. Now, if you put there your application made by the company in a country which name you cannot pronounce, where you subcontracted all the work, and they sort of made a software which kind of almost does the same thing that was supposed to happen, chances are that the people who are making Apache, who are making Red Hat Linux, etc., are more qualified and have done more testing. And not only that, but it's actually harder to screw up with those. So obviously you have the occasional somebody left the guest account open or somebody didn't have any passwords or whatever. But I would say that in most cases where you have these problems, it comes from an issue in an application. And increasingly also, if we compare purely volumes, so not like based on importance, but more like how often are people hacking, what's the usual cause, I don't have a study to cite right now, but I would presume that, for example, the Drupal issue mentioned earlier, when it happened a couple of years ago, it was basically everywhere, and everybody running Drupal is suddenly vulnerable to this horrible thing that lets you inject code into the system. So obviously this generates a lot of problems, because suddenly everybody is vulnerable, and it's really easy to exploit it. Some of these more technical issues that have come up with Linux, for example, or some sort of more infrastructure-related stuff, they are typically a little bit harder to exploit. They might require a bit of thinking. It's not like one-size-fits-all type of thing. With something like Drupal or whatever, when there's a problem, it's usually so that everybody is vulnerable, regardless of what you do. You just by default you're vulnerable and the same hack is going to apply to you. That's the problem. But yeah, definitely applications by far.
I was wondering, how do you feel about web application firewalls? Since we have a bunch of vendors selling their solutions and saying that this will protect you from XSS and stuff like that. Use this and...
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, we sometimes suggest them as a solution to customers who have already known vulnerable applications. They have a legacy application, it's garbage, it's made by somebody, no longer maintained. So throw in a web application firewall, customize it so that it hooks into whatever problems you have, and suddenly your problems are sort of gone. So they do have a place. Now, when it comes down to something like, well, just put this product into your network, just slap it in there, don't care about it, let the stuff flow, and suddenly you are secure. Not really so. Because the problem is that, I mean, if you think about it, these boxes are not doing anything magical. They have to look into the messages to figure out if some of the content looks bad. Yesterday we had a problem at the office because we were trying to send some message in some internal testing, and our internal mysterious box, which is trying to monitor our traffic for malicious attacks, decided that when you have a plaintext message where there's the PGP, if you've seen a PGP email, there is a PGP signature thing at the first, and then there's some garbage, and then there's the closing tag for PGP. So if some message, for some reason, contains these two things, the starting and the ending block, the system assumes that somebody's trying to steal some PGP private keys, and this has to be stopped. So if you go to a website which is on HTTP and try to access it, and somebody put these two tags there, they can be in any sort of completely arbitrary order even. Suddenly you get a reset package for unknown reasons, so now you don't see the website at all. And this is all caused by the fact that it's actually very poor at detecting any sort of reasonable attacks, because if you think about it, it's just random stuff flowing through. And now you are trying to make a value judgment that maybe this looks like an XSS. Okay, but what if I encode it? What if I escape it in this and that way? What if I put this sort of garbage in? In many audits, we have actually gone through different web application firewalls by just modifying the payload a little bit. Okay, so you are checking for this, how about I just add some garbage here? Okay, now you are not getting it anymore. So definitely don't think of them as a way to fix XSS or SQL injection. They are a way to sometimes occasionally stop further harm or detect some issues. But don't think of it as a way to stop caring about the issue. It's not a fix to the issue, it's sometimes a kind of a damper to it, that you can make the situation which is bad a little bit better. But you should really focus on not making the situation bad. By the way, there is some interesting research being done. I saw this, it was like last year, I think, there was a paper published by somebody. They had created this a Java virtual machine, and the idea was that it was basically trying to map all the different workflows in the code. So what can happen? And based on that, it was trying to basically figure out that if some sort of input at some point would cause, for example, an XSS, then it just prevents it magically. It was literally just magic. It was just mapping things and figuring out that if this happens, if that happens, in the future the program might be in a state where there is an XSS. So let's prevent it now. And this comes to the, at that point when you can do that and when it's reliable, at that point we can come to a point where we can say, okay, XSS doesn't matter quite as much. But at the moment, if your WAF is based on the idea of reading stuff and making a best guess, then it's almost always defeatable. There is a disturbing lack of questions about boats, cars, women, anything. I am quite surprised.
How many boats do you have?
I just sold mine to somebody.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.